Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Today's video is the first in a short three-part series about how fencing schools in the 16th and early 17th century were actually organised. In part one today, we're going to look at the physical setup of schools and talk a little bit about how they were organised on a practical basis. Let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is actually define what a fencing school actually is. So bear in mind that in the late Renaissance period, there would have been different ways of actually learning and training in the art of fencing. Some people may have had private teachers, especially if they were rich nobles or perhaps royalty. And of course, there would have been some kind of drill instructors attached to military organizations. These are out with the topic for this video. We're talking about specific schools designed to teach the art of fencing. So in period English, these were mostly referred to as fence schools or fencing schools, quite simply. There is a hint in George Silver's writings that the more pretentious sort of instructor may have referred to their organization as a college rather than a school. So that's another possibility. In Italian, you sometimes hear the term sala d'armi used, which would directly translate to the weapons hall, but this is often anglified as the fencing salle, or just salle for short. So within modern discussions, the word salle is often used to be synonymous with, for example, the Japanese martial arts dojo. So if you hear these terms, salle is the equivalent of dojo, just meaning a school. So anyway, that's a little bit about the nomenclature of fencing schools. I'm going to use the term fencing school because it is period appropriate English. Okay, this image is one of the few accurate and realistic portrayals of an actual fencing school from the late Renaissance period. So this particular image is of the fencing school attached to the University of Leiden in the Netherlands from round about 1600. And I believe it is a typical fencing school of the era. So as we look at this image, I'm going to read out a description of a fencing school in London, which was run by an Italian fencing master, as it happens. This description is taken from George Silver's book from the late 1590s. So yeah, let's get to it. Here is the extract. According to Silver, this master disbursed a great sum of money for the lease of a fair house in Warwick Lane, which he called his college. He caused to be fairly drawn and set round about his school all the noblemen's and gentlemen's arms, meaning their coats of arms, that were his scholars, and hanging right under their arms their rapiers, daggers, gloves of mail, and gauntlets. Also he had benches and stools, the room being very large, for gentlemen to sit round about his school to behold his teaching. He goes on to say that the room included some desks and writing equipment in case the gentleman needed to take a break to write some correspondence. And then he says, and to know how the time passed, he had in one corner of his school a clock with a very fair large dial. He had within that school a room, the which was called his privy school, with many weapons therein, where he did teach his scholars his secret fight, after he had perfectly taught them the rules. He was very much beloved in the court. Okay, so we can see some of these features that Silver described in this picture. For example, the racks of weapons hanging on the walls and the benches around the side for people to sit and watch what was going on, and of course the scholars practicing on the floor. Interestingly, we can also see somebody doing some kind of conditioning training on the bottom left of the picture by vaulting on the saddle. And I believe that the figure in the bottom right holding the staff is the teacher. The allusion of Silver to a separate area or separate room even for private one-to-one tuition is interesting. This aspect is also referred to in Achille Marozzo's treatise from the earlier 1500s. And one other thing we should note is that people could watch what was happening in the training hall. So there's a reference in Antonio Manciolino's work of 1531 to spectators watching the training. And in fact, Achille Marozzo also mentions some aspect of public performance being part of the training. So that's also interesting to think about. Another thing we can get from Manciolino's work is the following extract. He says, "It is customary among the commonest teachers of our art, that reason-based warden against injury, to place long stretches of paper in the highest and noblest part of their salle, bearing, they say, the principles of their instruction. Certainly, he who reads these banners will find they contain principles." He goes on to criticize this practice. He wasn't a fan of it, but that is beside the point. So he's essentially describing posters which have presumably quotations or perhaps diagrams describing the principles of what was being taught. And remember, he said this was common. This next image is taken from Achille Marozzo's treatise of the 1530s. So in that work, Marozzo advised teachers in the salle to draw this segno or sign or diagram on the floor. So this is a geometrical training aid designed to teach footwork to the students. This is actually mentioned in other sources as well. You perhaps noticed a similar diagram on the floor of the Leiden picture, and Gérard Thibault in the 1630s in his book also talks about the need to draw such a diagram. So I think this would be a very useful training aid which was used by at least some fencing schools. This next diagram is taken from the German master Joachim Meyer's treatise of around about 1570. So basically this is further evidence for some kind of geometrical footwork diagram on the ground. And in this case we can also see some kind of thrusting target attached to the wall. And note the instructor giving some advice to the scholar as he practices. Just a quick note to say that the decorations and background of this picture are very fanciful and not a realistic portrayal of school with all those classical statues and whatnot. But the diagram or training sign on the floor and on the wall are presumably realistic. Okay, the last piece of evidence I want to talk about today is taken from an essay by Linda Carlisle McCollum. This was published in 2005, I believe, and it is about the early rapier in England. So that's Elizabethan and Jacobean England. So what we get from McCollum's article is an interesting reference and description of how fencing schools were set up and run. And particularly, she mentions one fencing master who basically rented a large house and had a special room inside his house in which he offered private lessons. But there are also references within the essay to fencing masters hiring commercial properties in which to set up their cells and offer lessons to the public. So this is significant because it tells us that fencing schools generally took place in rented rooms or buildings. So they would not be custom-made structures for the practice of fencing. They would just be large rooms, large halls, rented as necessary by a fencing instructor. And presumably classes were then advertised publicly to attract clients. Okay, so that brings us to the end of part one, the discussion about the setup of fencing schools. We will continue next time with part two, in which we look at training exercises and methodology. See you soon. Bye.